I'm trained as an economist. So I'm a professor at University of Southern California. I also co-founded a research consultancy called the Behavioralist, which is where I do most of my research through these days. And Yes Backerson, the managing director, is here today as well. So I just wanted to sort of give you a quick presentation on where is economics today and how it can be applied to the dating industry. And in particular, how do we measure value, and in particular consumer value of an online product like a dating app? Okay, so like my moment-to-moment life is eating and breathing economics. So this is kind of like the 40,000-foot approach as to where we are today. So I would say three things have sort of advanced in economics over the last 20 or 30 years that really do apply to the dating industry. The first is the theory of behavior change. The second is, I'd say, causal inference or experimentation. And the third is consumer value. And I would like to convince you all today that economics has something valuable to say about these three things. And so I'll just talk briefly about 1, 2, and then I'll focus the rest of the talk, like 5 minutes or so, on consumer value, and then take as many questions as I can from you all. So I think, as Mark was saying, behavioral economics has become an important part of economics. And, since I would say Kahneman and Tversky in 1979, we now have, I think economists have tried to incorporate psychology as much as we can into understanding why do people have certain preferences that they do, why do they hold certain beliefs that they do, and why do they behave in certain markets that they do. So in technical terms, that's called non-standard preferences, beliefs, and decision-making. And I think all these different types of psychological and sociological approaches have been to some extent incorporated into standard economics, which has been really good. Because economics does have really good tools about prediction and about behavior, but now it's got a more nuanced and fine-grained approach to human behavior. And as a result, economists have become better at measuring people's preferences for the things that you sell, the goods, the services, or even in thinking about the preferences that consumers have for different types of mates. And so with the advancement of behavioral science and economics, now we have just better models to predict what people will do in the future. And that's been service not just for policymakers, but also for companies as well. And that's why every large tech company that you can think of, that's on the S&P 500 or any of the indexes, they use tons of economists and behavioral economists to better predict what their customers are going to do in the future, just because we've got better tools and better theories today. So that's been a major advancement in the labor market for economists anyway, has been the tech industry. And then thirdly is we've seen rapid theoretical advancement about matching, about why certain people or certain organizations match with certain people or organizations. So we have, Lloyd Shapley and Alvin Roth in 2012 getting the Nobel Prize for matching markets. This year we had Wilson and Milgram who are doing like auction matching markets. So the field is very active in terms of predicting what will happen in certain circumstances. This applies to the dating industry. Now we have models to know what type of individuals are going to care more about what we call vertical preferences, which are things that are desirable from all people, versus horizontal preferences, which are things that are more spread out. So, do people care more about income as opposed to their personal interests and personalities? These are things now we have theories for to predict what people are going to do, which is a really major advancement. So that's kind of the quick overview of the theory of behavior change in economics over the last 20, 30 years. In tandem, we've had an explosion of experimentation. So the scientific method of randomizing sessions, customers, employees, companies into randomized controlled trials is now, it's totally taken off. And most tech companies have not just economists to do theory and prediction in companies, but also to help with experimentation. And experimentation and randomized control trials are kind of like the best method to establish whether your product or a feature of your product or a price that you charge actually delivers value to your customers. Without that, you're just left with correlations, and that could be, those correlations could have come about through spurious relationships. So now we have like matching theorists now working with experimentalists like myself to actually understand how well can we predict future behavior of consumers in data markets and in other matching markets, and then try to refine our theories. And only through experimentation can you refine a prediction. So machine learning has obviously taken off, but machine learning can't tell you what price you should set something at. You need to have experimentation in there. And so that's why any good machine learning position will incorporate a lot of experimentation into it, because you need to have that feedback into the model. And that relates to adaptive experimentation. So adaptive experimentation is, we don't need to experiment on all of your customers. We only need a small sample. And we've got really cool theories out there like Bayes' theorem to help us actually have smaller sample sizes. So we can put actually more money onto the horse that wins the race earlier on, essentially. So we don't need to have millions of customers in an experiment. We need to have maybe hundreds or thousands at most. So there's been a lot of advancement in using what's called adaptive experimentation. And I can talk more about that at the end. But I wanted to, and Mark and I discussed about what would be interesting to talk about is thinking about consumer value. So how do you measure the value of a dating product? And I'll just take a step back and give you an approach of how we think we measure consumer value in markets generally, and then we can think about the dating industry. So in every regulator or legislator around the world will try to measure what's called consumer surplus or consumer value to understand whether to regulate or not that company. And how they do that is to understand what's people's willingness to pay for the product so that they can assess value. So there are, I would say, 3 philosophical approaches to understanding well-being. First is kind of like an Aristotle flourishing account, like you should be virtuous, you should do these things, and if you do these things, you have high well-being. There are subjective accounts, which is like if you are happier and you report that you are happier, therefore are happier with that product. And the third one, which is where this fits into, is the more that you're willing to pay for a good, the happier that you'll be with the good. Okay, and that comes from sort of the marginal revolution in economics in the 50s and 60s, and that dominates the discussion on consumer value today. So every cost-benefit analysis that will be done in the US and around the world will use consumer surplus or consumer value as measured through willingness to pay. Okay, this is where some of the recent discussion about how to regulate Facebook, Instagram, Twitter come about is because they're not actually charging customers for the product. So how can we actually extract consumer value to know that they should be regulated or not? So that's been an interesting wrinkle over the last 5-10 years of using willingness to pay. But you can use surrogate outcomes. So it might be the likelihood of getting married on a platform, the product satisfaction, the quality of the match, so forth. But essentially, willingness to pay is what is the ultimate numerator to use for understanding consumer value. But it's not only just interesting for consumer value, it's also important for profit maximization. So you actually want to know what the demand curve of your product looks like. If you know what the shape of it, so the shape and the level, then you can set prices to maximize profit. Okay, without knowing what that demand curve looks like, you kind of just search in the dark for what is the right price. So this is where I mentioned theory and I mentioned experimentation, is because those two together with understanding willingness to pay allows you to set the right price for your product so that you actually you can maximize either the surplus that goes to the consumers, or you can maximize the surplus that goes to yourself or to the market in generally. And so that's why it's important to understand what people are willing to pay for the product. So what this means in a graphical sense. So consumer value is like really difficult to estimate, but easy to draw. So I can actually draw it quite easily on an Econ 101 slide, right? Which is where we have a demand curve for a product, and we got the supply curve. The supply curve could be even horizontal, which it might be in the case for many of you in the dating industry. So essentially what we want to do as economists or regulators, or for us as a society to understand the value of your product, we want to know, say, if you did value your product at, say, $5, that was the market price, what would be people's willingness to pay above that? Like how many people would be willing to pay, say, $10, $9, $8, $7, $6, and so forth? And that allows us then to map out the demand curve. Because essentially what we will have at these points is what's called price elasticities of demand. And so if we know what they are, then we can measure what's called consumer value. Consumer value is the triangle under the demand curve and above the market price. So that's when we try to understand, should companies or should markets be regulated? It's about, how much of the consumers are getting of this triangle, or I would say of like this greater triangle. This is the surplus that goes to you as a dating company. This is what goes to the consumers. And so when I've been working with companies, we've been trying to figure out, what is this triangle? How can we measure the value that you as a company are providing to your consumers? And so if prices are what we call elastic, people are really sensitive to price, then the value is going to be small, okay, at that market price. The triangle becomes really, really shallow. So small changes in prices that you set, so if you say, I want to set the price rather than $6 rather than $5, you might actually end up losing quite a lot of money. So knowing how elastic your consumers are is really important for understanding, do you set the right prices? And then conversely, if prices are inelastic, you change prices a little and you don't get much change in quantity demanded. And so that's where understanding what the shape of the demand curve for many of the tech companies now is first order. Amazon do it, Uber do it, Instacart do it, Microsoft do it. They're all trying to figure out, how can we estimate what this demand curve looks like? Okay, so I'll give you an example of Uber. So back in 2014 and 15, myself and a few colleagues approached Uber to understand Uber. And for me, I was living in Chicago at the time, during the winter, and trying to go out for a beer with friends and get outside and it's minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, you're really looking for a cab. And so Uber kind of changed my life in terms of search costs. It was just an amazing product that actually was delivering so much more value above what the competitors were doing, which were the black cabs. And so we went to Uber thinking, well, this consumer surplus is going to be pretty large. Like they would charge me a price of, say, $10 to get from one side of Chicago to the next. I was probably willing to pay $40. And so that was a $30 surplus that Uber was creating as a result of their product. Okay, so along with Steve Levitt, who's the author of Freakonomics, and you can see the podcast about our paper here, we tried to understand, what does that demand curve look like for Uber? And that's what we did. So we used half of their data from 2015 to say, okay, we have their base price. What happens when we sort of have good natural variation of the price increasing? So if you all used Uber back in 2015, they wouldn't give you the actual price. They would tell you what the search multiplier was. So we have that on the y-axis. That's the price. And we can then see at different points, what are people's elasticities. So what we actually estimate is, for every 10% increase in the price, demand would decrease by about 5 percentage points. So we actually have that in the data, and that's in the paper, and you can go and see it. But the importance of that paper was to show, what is this area, this sort of triangle, should we say, what is the value of that area on the demand curve, but above the base price? But we know exactly what the number of rides were. We know what the price is, so we can just do what the consumer surplus was. So back in 2015, we estimate the consumer surplus from just from using 4 cities in the US, extrapolate into the rest of the US, about $7 billion. So Uber was transferring $7 billion of surplus from the product to consumers. The revenue to drivers was about $8 billion. Most of that is not surplus. And the company back in 2015 was only generating about $2 billion in revenues. So actually the consumer surplus was dwarfing the revenues. So now we have clear evidence that this product is delivering significant value to the market, and therefore they could go to stakeholders and say, this is the value to you, city mayor, or to you, stakeholder, of this product to its customers. And so that led to, Uber having a lot of conversation about what is the right price and how we can deliver more surplus to consumers. So that's the kind of like the standard way that now we can use big data with experimentation and with a theory of consumer value to show what is the value of your product to your stakeholders. But as I said before, it's also a really important way to know how you should be pricing the product. Like if this demand curve is very shallow, then getting the price right is really important. Really, really important for profit maximization. If this demand curve is more vertical, then prices don't matter so much. People are just inelastic. They just really, really want the good beyond what the market price is. Okay. So I think we have the tools. So over the last 20, 30 years, economics has advanced tremendously on the theoretical and empirical side. I think we now have new exciting tools and elements of economics to understand the value of different platforms in the dating industry. As I said before, this approach gives you a nice understanding about what is the price you should be using to profit maximize, what's the price you should be charging for new bundles of products that you offer, but also understand the societal value of your platform. And that's what we did for Uber, is to say, this is the societal value coming from this product. And that's the only way that you can really do it. And that's the only way that regulators will understand it. If you say, what's your match efficiency, or how many marriages, or how many dates come out of it, that's just really hard to put into a number, into a currency. But willingness to pay is easy. It's already in that currency. And that's why it's used in benefit cost analysis around the world.